We have here an account of the good Christ did in Samaria when he passed through that country in his way to Galilee. The Samaritans, both in blood and religion, were mongrel Jews, the posterity of those colonies which the king of Assyria planted there after the captivity of the 10 tribes, with whom the poor of the land that were left behind, and many other Jews afterwards incorporated themselves. They worshipped the God of Israel only, to whom they erected a temple on Mount Gerizim in competition with that at Jerusalem. There was a great enmity between them and the Jews. The Samaritans would not admit Christ when they saw he was going to Jerusalem. The Jews thought they could not give him a worse name than to say he is a Samaritan. When the Jews were in prosperity, the Samaritans claimed kindred to them. But when the Jews were in distress, they were Medes and Persians. Hatred between Jews and Samaritans was fierce and long-standing. It dated all the way back to the days of the patriarchs. Jacob had 12 sons, whose descendants became 12 tribes. Joseph, his favorite, was despised by the other brothers, and they attempted to do away with him. But God intervened and not only preserved Joseph's life, but used him to preserve the lives of the entire clan. Before his death, Jacob gave Joseph a blessing in which he called him a fruitful bough by a well. The blessing was fulfilled, as the territory allotted to the tribes of the Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim, doubly fruitful, and Manasseh was the fertile land that eventually became Samaria. Later, Israel divided into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom, called Israel, established its capital first at Shechem, a revered site in Jewish history, and later at the hilltop city of Samaria. In 722 BC, the city fell to the Assyrians and became the headquarters of the Assyrian province of Samaria. Assyria conquered Israel and took most of its people into captivity. The invaders then brought in Gentile colonies from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and from Sepharvaim. The foreigners brought with them the pagan idols, which the remaining Jews began to worship alongside the God of Israel. Intermarriages also took place. While many of the inhabitants of the city and the surrounding area of Samaria were left off into captivity, some farmers and others were left behind. They intermarried with new settlers from Mesopotamia and Syria. Though the Samaritans were condemned by the Jews, Hartman says they probably had as much pure Jewish blood as the Jews who later returned from Babylonian exile. The story of both Israel's and Samaria's failures in keeping to the way of Yahweh is partly told in chapter 17 of the 2nd book of the Kings. There too, the sacred author tells how the king of Assyria sent a priest from among the exiles to teach the Samaritans how to worship God after an attack by lions was attributed to their failure to worship the God of the land. 2nd Kings recounts how worship of Yahweh was mixed with the worship of strange gods. When Cyrus permitted the Jews to return from Babylonian exile, the Samaritans were ready to welcome them back. The exiles, however, despised the Samaritans as renegades. When the Samaritans wanted to join in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, their assistance was rejected. You will find this in the book of Ezra, chapter 4. With the rejection came political hostility and opposition. The Samaritans tried to undermine the Jews with their Persian rulers and slowed the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its temple. Nehemiah tells us that a grandson of the high priest Eliashib had married a daughter of Sanballat, the governor of the province of Samaria, for defiling the priesthood by marrying a non-Jewish woman. Nehemiah drove Eliashib from Jerusalem, though Sanballat was a worshipper of Yahweh. According to the historian Josephus, Sanballat then had a temple built on Mount garrison in which his son-in-law Eliashib could function. Apparently, this is when the full break between Jews and Samaritans took place. Meanwhile, the Samaritans, who had resisted paganism, developed their own version of worship using only the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and rejecting all other books of the Old Testament. Tensions increased when the Samaritans built their own temple for worship on Mount Gerizim and stated that their mountain was the dwelling place of the Lord, not the temple in Jerusalem. With that, any hope of reconciliation between the two peoples was lost. According to John Mackenzie in his Dictionary of the Bible, the Samaritans later allied themselves with the Seleucids in the Maccabean Wars, and in 128 BC, the Jews destroyed the Samaritans' temple and ravaged the territory. Around the time of Jesus' birth, a band of Samaritans profaned the temple in Jerusalem by scattering the bones of dead people in the sanctuary. In our own era, which has witnessed the vandalism of synagogues and the burning of black churches, we should be able to understand the anger and hate such acts would incite. The fact that there was such dislike and hostility between Jews and Samaritans is what gives the use of the Samaritan in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Such force, the Samaritan is the one who is able to rise above the bigotry and prejudices of centuries and show mercy and compassion for the injured Jew after the Jew's own countrymen pass him by. It is with those centuries of opposition and incidents behind their peoples that we can understand the surprise of the Samaritan woman when Jesus rises above the social and religious restrictions, not just of a man talking to a woman, but also of a Jew talking to a Samaritan. By the 1st century, and most likely long before, both Jewish and Samaritan priests taught their people that it was sinful to have any contact with the other. Jews were to avoid the impure land of the Samaritans, and Samaritans were not to speak to the Jews. In addition, Samaritans and the Jews fed their mutual hatred with insult and injury. There are countless modern parallels to the Jewish-Samaritan enmity indeed, wherever peoples are divided by racial and ethnic barriers. Perhaps that's why the Gospels and Acts provide so many instances of Samaritans coming into contact with the message of Jesus. It is not the person from the radical different culture on the other side of the world that is hardest to love, but the nearby neighbor whose skin color, language, rituals, values, ancestry, history, and customs are different from one's own.